and I don't know what to say about Israel really, except at some point I realized, because we've had a similar trajectory on this, that the Israeli government of any kind was never really committed to a two-state solution. I think it was bullshit almost all the way down. And I think in reality also my main anger about liberal internationalists and liberal Zionists about this was that I think it was all the way down for them too, but they lied about it. And the reason I came to that rather sad conclusion is because at any point where we might actually have been able to put some pressure, we might actually have been able to move things hard, we balked every single time. And there was no pressure from liberal Zionists on either Democratic or Republican administrations to push the Israelis to make concessions. And so now it's too late. It's obviously too late. There's no way we're going to have a two-state solution. It's been created to avoid that. I also honestly can't see your solution or some one nation solution operating. So to some extent, Zionism has failed. Is that how would you respond to that?
I mean, it depends on what one thinks the goals of Zionism were, right?
Of course.
I mean, in some ways, right? I mean,
well, Jabotinsky's Zionism has succeeded.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you take the darker view that you're taking, and
it's not a view I want to take. It's not a view that I used to take. I have been forced by observing reality, and then during the Obama years, in particular, the contempt with which the Israelis treated the Americans is just shocking to me. It's as if seriously.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with that. I think that, look, if you believe that the point of purpose of political Zionism, just cultural Zionism maybe was a different thing, but political Zionism was the idea of basically creating a state in which Jews would be politically supreme, and therefore safe, and would allow a certain kind of Jewish self-expression that's possible in a majority Jewish society in this particular land that Jews have always looked to. Then Zionism has, for the moment, succeeded. But whether but at the cost of of crushing Palestinians, the UN says that Gaza is uninhabitable for human beings, of just a horrific cost for Palestinians. And I think that I think it's, I think that it may possibly, and one of the reasons that I think that it's impossible to forget that Israelis are not reconsidering is that things have worked out too well for them at this point, right? I mean, South Africa, to go to that analogy, where South Africans didn't reconsider because they woke up one day and thought, we feel really bad about this, right? It was basically the country was up in flames in the 80s, and the government realized it didn't have the capacity to put that revolt down.
It also had nowhere near the demographic balance that Israel has. I mean, the whites in South Africa were, what percentage of the population are they? Were
smaller, right? And they didn't have the international support, both political, and they also weren't the economic magnet that Israel had. Israel has economically and technologically a lot of things that a lot of countries want. So it's very hard to isolate economically. I think that we're probably headed for a long period of what I would guess would be a status quo, but perhaps a more one with more open episodes of violence, because one of the reasons that things have been calm for Israeli Jews is there's been a kind of indirect, to use a British colonial term, indirect rule in the West Bank, which is to say the Palestinian Authority has basically served as Israel's subcontractor. And so it means that the Israeli 18-year-olds don't have to patrol every Palestinian village and town, makes the cost of that control lower. I do think that probably one point that sooner or later the PA, which has lost all its legitimacy, will collapse. Palestinians rely on it for jobs, but they didn't sign up to be to manage their own oppression. And once that collapses, then Israel faces a more difficult choice, because it wants to maintain control at low cost. right? And direct control is much more costly. That's the reason Oslo came about in the first place in large measure, because the first intifada showed Israelis that the cost of direct control when the Palestinians were in revolt was too high. I think when the Palestinian Authority collapses, maybe some new debates can emerge. I think that to me, an equal binational state is the worst option except for all the other options, given that the other options, the main other option we have right now is what, B'Tselem has called apartheid, which I think is ultimately, first of all, just not morally totally unacceptable. But I also believe in the long run that when you subject another weaker people to remorseless violence, that sooner or later the violence comes back to you. I fear that as well, and that's why I believe that ultimately an equal state will be a problematic and difficult place to manage, but I think a better place.
What about the obvious option, alternative to that, which is rather euphemistically called population transfer? In other words, to do to the Arabs of the West Bank what happened to many of the Arabs in Israel proper in 1948 and thereafter. And one can imagine a conflagration coming about which prompts a very right-wing nationalist government in Jerusalem, and you could see ethnic cleansing, as it were, as a last resort. What
Absolutely.
To be honest with you, I think that the last 10 years I've regarded that as almost inevitable.